My name is Alicia Lane. I am 53 years old. 2 weeks ago, I sat in an upscale seafood restaurant overlooking Narragansett Bay, surrounded by my family, and watched my 21-year-old stepdaughter raise her glass of Pinot Grigio. She looked right at me, smiled, and said to Dad's retirement plan. The room went dead silent. I waited for my husband of 2 years to say something. Instead, he pulled out a gold-embossed business card, handed it to the waiter to show off, and then pressed his hand hard over my wrist. He looked me in the eye and said, "She is not your daughter, Alicia. Do not correct her." What I did the very next morning cost him his luxury car, dismantled his Rhode Island boating business, and exposed a financial lie so deep it almost cost me my historic home. Before I tell you exactly how I took back every single dime, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Emily Told Stories, but only if you genuinely enjoy it. I would also love to know how old you are and where you are listening from today. Now let me take you back to that table. The chime of a silver spoon tapping against thin crystal sliced through the low hum of conversation. We were seated at Coastline Prime. The tall windows offered an unobstructed view of the moonlit bay. The crisp salt air outside could not penetrate the climate-controlled dining room. It smelled faintly of seared scallops and expensive perfume. I had booked this table 3 weeks in advance to celebrate my sister Joanne getting a promotion. It was supposed to be her night. Instead, Kelsey stood up. She wore a silk slip dress that cost more than my first car, a purchase I had authorized just 2 days prior. She raised her glass, the pale liquid catching the ambient candlelight. Her voice carried that distinct, breezy confidence of youth, unburdened by consequence. She took a sip, shifted her gaze across the table, and locked eyes with me. A practiced smirk touched the corners of her mouth. "Long may she fund our weekends," she added. Joanne lowered her fork. The waiter, who had been pouring sparkling water into Derek's glass, froze. The bottle hovered inches above the rim. Even the neighboring tables seemed to stop chewing. I sat perfectly still. Managing a sprawling healthcare network had taught me the tactical advantage of silence. You learn more by watching how people fill a void than by speaking into it yourself. I waited for my husband to offer even a token defense of the woman paying for the very wine his daughter was currently swallowing. Derek did not look at me. He casually adjusted his cuffs, shooting a winning smile at the waiter. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored blazer and pulled out a pristine, gold-embossed business card. "Derek Lane, Newport Brokerage," he said, handing the thick card to the young man. "If you ever decide you want to upgrade from pouring water to sailing on it, give my office a ring." The waiter offered a confused nod and hurried away. "Kelsey," I said, my tone even, devoid of any rising inflection. "That was inappropriate. You owe me an apology." Kelsey rolled her eyes, slouching back into her chair. She looked at her father, telegraphing an unspoken plea to intervene. Derek leaned toward me. He did not raise his voice. He reached across the crisp white tablecloth and placed his hand over my wrist. The weight of his palm pressed down, pinning my arm to the table. His grip was not bruising, just heavy enough to make his point clear. A physical punctuation mark. "She is not your daughter, Alicia," he said. His tone, smooth-pitched, just loud enough for the adjacent diners to catch every syllable. "Do not correct her." My pulse hummed in my ears, but my expression remained frozen. I looked down at his hand. I noticed the fraying edge of his shirt cuff. I noticed the condensation pooling at the base of my water glass. I felt a sudden, profound stillness settle into my bones. The kind of clarity that arrives right before a storm makes landfall on the coast. I slipped my wrist out from under his palm. I picked up my linen napkin, folded it neatly into a square, and set it beside my plate. I offered Derek a tight, polite smile. "Fine," I said. He smirked, returning his attention to his meal, convinced he had won. He sliced into his roasted sea bass, unaware that with 5 simple words he had just severed the invisible financial umbilical cord keeping his entire life afloat. People frequently ask why capable women stay quiet in moments of profound disrespect. They assume silence is a symptom of weakness. They believe a strong woman would throw a glass of wine, stand up, and cause a scene worthy of reality television. They do not understand that for a certain type of person, silence is not a surrender. Silence is an audit. To understand why I did not raise my voice at that restaurant, you have to understand the architecture of the life I built before Derek ever walked into it. 7 years ago, I stood alone in the echoing foyer of a historic Victorian home in South Kingstown. The air smelled of old pine floorboards and dormant dust. I held a heavy brass key in my palm. The cold metal pressed into my skin felt like a trophy. I had earned that key through decades of grueling administrative labor. I spent 30 years managing hospital logistics, untangling supply chains, and negotiating vendor contracts while eating cold sandwiches over a glowing monitor. I raised my son Connor on a tight budget, balancing soccer practices with 60-hour work weeks. Buying that house with its wraparound porch and original stained glass windows was my personal summit. It was secure. It was solid. It was entirely mine. Then came a charity luncheon at a local marina. Derek leaned against a mahogany bar, swirling a glass of scotch looking like a catalog model for coastal living. He sold luxury yachts to people with more money than sense. He was charming in a way that felt practiced but remarkably effective. He remembered my coffee order after one meeting. He noticed the subtle shift in my perfume. After years of being the person everyone relied on to fix broken systems, it felt intoxicating to have someone ask how my day went and actually wait for the answer. I wanted a partner to share the quiet Sunday mornings. I wanted a second chapter. The financial boundary erosion did not happen overnight. Con artists never start by asking for the vault combination. They ask for a glass of water. The creep was insidious. It started with Kelsey's cell phone during a mundane Tuesday evening in the kitchen. Derek sighed heavily, rubbing his temples, complaining about his carrier holding him on the phone for an hour. He asked if it would be easier to just bundle her onto my corporate family plan. He framed it as a temporary convenience. I logged into my account, clicked a few buttons, and absorbed the monthly charge. I felt efficient. I felt helpful. 6 months later, the boundary shifted again. Kelsey backed her sedan into a light pole. Derek's auto insurance premiums spiked. While chopping vegetables for dinner, he made an offhand joke about how my flawless driving record could save them hundreds of dollars a month if I just added her new leased SUV to my policy. He kissed my cheek and called me a lifesaver. I made the call. The money drafted from my checking account on the 14th of every month. A silent, recurring deduction that became background noise. Then came the university tuition. I remember the exact moment. A missed payment deadline resulted in a panicked phone call from Kelsey. Derek paced the living room, claiming a large commission check from a yacht sale was delayed in escrow. He looked stressed, rubbing the back of his neck, talking about high-interest penalty fees. I logged into the university portal and paid the bursar directly to secure her class schedule. I told myself this is what families do. We cover the gaps when someone stumbles. I mistook my own utility for being loved. I thought my financial competence made me indispensable to them. I did not realize it just made me a convenient utility. Derek loved to drive us through Newport on Sunday afternoons. We would cruise down Ocean Drive in his sleek silver Audi, the crisp salt breeze rushing through the open windows. He would point out the iconic Gilded Age mansions lining the cliffs. The Breakers, Marble House, Rosecliff. He spoke about those sprawling properties with a reverence he rarely directed at living, breathing people. "Look at the stonework," he would say, staring at the ornate gates. "Look at the legacy they built." He was obsessed with the facade of wealth. My background in facility operations meant I saw those historic estates very differently. I saw the crumbling mortar facing the sea. I knew the constant ocean spray was rotting the wooden supports from the inside out. They required millions of dollars in hidden maintenance just to keep standing. They were gorgeous husks, stately on the outside but decaying underneath. I just had not recognized that my husband was built exactly the same way. Over the last few months, the decay had started to seep through his polished exterior. He became strange, forgetful in ways that felt unsettling. I would find his heavy leather key fob sitting in the refrigerator next to the milk carton. He missed a critical lunch meeting with a prospective yacht buyer, claiming the calendar alert never synced to his phone, though I saw the notification on his screen myself. He lost a stack of important tax documents, swearing he left them on the kitchen island, only for me to find them shoved in the back of his golf bag. When I tried to gently ask about these lapses, he would turn defensive. He would insist I moved his things or failed to remind him of his schedule. I covered for him. I smoothed over the missed appointments with his clients. I assumed the unpredictable fluctuations in the maritime economy were causing severe sleep deprivation and stress. I bought him a leather-bound planner. I scheduled him a physical with a top physician in my network. I functioned as the ultimate shock absorber for his life, taking the hits so he could keep rolling smoothly down the coast. I genuinely believed I was supporting a loving partner through a difficult season of life. The dinner at Coastline Prime ripped that fragile illusion apart. When he placed his hand over my wrist and commanded me not to correct his daughter, the fog of my own excuses evaporated. A man struggling with stress might snap under pressure. A man losing his cognitive function might be confused or disoriented. But a man who leverages his wife's hard-earned wealth while publicly erasing her parental authority is not broken or confused. He is calculating. The dinner revealed his true nature in sharp, defining contrast. He valued his fragile ego and his unearned social standing far more than he valued my dignity. The silence I held at that restaurant table was not submission. It was a rigorous internal inventory. I sat there reviewing the phone plans, the insurance drafts, the tuition receipts, the luxury car he drove, and the lavish lifestyle he paraded around Newport. I was the hidden foundation holding up his Gilded Age facade. He smirked at his plate, thinking my silence meant I was shrinking back into the role he assigned me. He thought I was just a quiet bank account wrapped in a wedding ring. He had no idea that beneath my polite smile, I was already mentally logging into every portal, severing the financial cables, and preparing to let his hollow life crash into the sea. I watched him take a sip of sparkling water, his gold-embossed business card sitting on the edge of the table. He felt untouchable. He felt like the king of a castle I had quietly financed. The drive home that night was quiet, the hum of the tires on the asphalt the only sound between us. I did not argue. I did not demand a conversation. I simply went to sleep. Because I knew exactly what needed to happen the moment the sun came up. My eyes opened at 4:30 in the morning. No alarm clock coaxed me awake. My internal rhythm, calibrated by 30 years of hospital shift management, simply pulled me from sleep with precise certainty. The master bedroom was dark, insulated by thick blackout curtains. Beside me, Derek exhaled, in a slow, steady cadence. He slept with the deep, untroubled ease of a man who believed the world existed to cushion his falls. I lay there for a moment, listening to the sound of his breathing. A younger version of myself might have stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling, twisting the bed sheets and crying over the humiliation I endured at the restaurant. That past version of Alicia would have rehearsed an emotional speech, begging for couples therapy, searching for a compromise that would stitch the illusion back together. But the woman lying in the dark today felt nothing but a cold, sterile clarity. I slid out from under the heavy down comforter, my bare feet finding the cool hardwood floor. I did not bother with slippers or a robe. I walked silently down the hallway, navigating the shadows of my South Kingstown home by memory. The house creaked, settling into the coastal chill. The familiar sounds felt like an old ally welcoming me back. I reached the kitchen, bypassing the overhead lights in a small pendant lamp suspended above the granite island. I brewed a pot of dark roast coffee. The grinding of the beans seemed deafening in the early morning quiet, but I knew the noise would not reach the second floor. While the coffee finished brewing, I opened my silver laptop. The screen flickered to life, casting a pale blue glow across my hands. I flexed my fingers over the keyboard. I was no longer a disappointed wife. I was a director of operations investigating a compromised department. I logged into my primary banking portal, bypassing the joint checking account and heading straight for the individual ledgers I had maintained long before I ever met my husband. I selected the date range for the past 18 months. A cascading list of transactions populated the screen, line after line of digital proof. I opened a blank spreadsheet beside the browser window. If you want to understand the true nature of a relationship, do not listen to the vows spoken at an altar or the sweet words whispered over a dinner table. Look at the bank statements. Numbers possess a pristine honesty. They do not gaslight. They do not spin a false narrative. They simply record the transfer of energy from one source to another. I began categorizing the outbound cash flow. The first column belonged to the least luxury SUV Kelsey drove. The monthly auto draft was $680. I noted the date of origin in the adjacent cell. I remembered the crisp autumn afternoon Derek handed her the keys in our driveway. He had beamed with fatherly pride while standing on pavement I had paid to seal, presenting a vehicle I was financing. I typed the figure into the spreadsheet. Next came the university expenses. The University of Rhode Island is a fine institution, but the out-of-pocket costs for housing, meal plans, and tuition installments were a heavy burden. I logged into the Bursa portal and documented the recurring transfers. Thousands of dollars exiting my savings every single semester to ensure a young woman who viewed me as a walking automated teller machine could enjoy a stress-free academic career. The deeper I scrolled through the records, the more the minor charges multiplied into a structural financial bleed. Sorority dues paid under the guise of an emergency networking requirement. Designer coastal apparel purchased on my authorized credit card at high-end boutiques in Providence and Newport. Eyelash extensions, spring break accommodations in Florida, premium gym memberships. I typed each amount, aligning the decimals with surgical precision. Each keystroke felt like pulling a tiny silver needle out of my own skin. I had funded this lavish lifestyle piece by piece under the false pretense of blending a family. I had told myself that providing a seamless financial safety net would eventually earn their respect. I had operated under the delusion that generosity was a universal currency capable of buying genuine affection. I stared at the final sum generated at the bottom of the spreadsheet. The number was breathtaking. It was the exact price tag of my own insecurity. For 2 years, I had quietly absorbed the parasitic weight of 2 adults who saw me not as a partner or a parent, but as an endless resource. I thought back to the dinner table. I remembered the heavy weight of Derek pressing his palm against my wrist, pinning me down in front of my sister and the restaurant staff. "She is not your daughter, Alicia," he had said. "Do not correct her." Those words echoed in the quiet kitchen, bouncing off the tile backsplash and the stainless steel appliances. He was right. She was not my daughter, and because she was not my daughter, I owed her nothing. The ingrained habit of shrinking my boundaries, of swallowing my discomfort to maintain a fragile domestic peace, shattered in that exact moment. The peace I had been keeping was nothing more than a hostage situation where I was paying my own ransom. I minimized the spreadsheet and opened a new browser tab. I returned to the university portal. I navigated to the Saved Payment Methods section. My Platinum card and routing numbers sat there, nested under the automatic billing settings. I hovered my cursor over the Delete button. I did not hesitate. I clicked Confirm. The payment method vanished from the system, severing her tuition supply. Next, I logged into the auto loan provider for the leased SUV. I navigated to the recurring draft scheduled for the upcoming Friday. I clicked Cancel. The screen flashed a warning about potential late fees and negative credit impacts. I dismissed the warning and finalized the cancellation. That was Derek's problem now. Finally, I accessed the management dashboard for my primary credit accounts. I found the authorized user section. Kelsey's name sat right below mine, granting her full access to my credit limit. With 3 clicks, her access was revoked. But I knew that would not be enough. Derek had likely memorized several of the numbers for online purchases. To be thorough, I flagged the entire account as lost. I requested a new card with new numbers to be rushed to my secure office address, ensuring the plastic would never cross the threshold of this house. The existing cards currently sitting in Derek's leather wallet and Kelsey's designer purse instantly became useless pieces of decorative plastic. I closed the browser tabs one by one, watching the screen return to a blank desktop. I closed the laptop, the soft click of the hinge echoing in the empty kitchen. I poured my dark roast coffee into a ceramic mug, inhaling the bitter steam. Outside the kitchen window, the sky above Rhode Island was beginning to shift from pitch black to a bruised, heavy indigo. The neighborhood was still asleep. The house was silent. I did not leave a dramatic handwritten note on the kitchen counter. I did not pack a suitcase or storm out the front door. I simply took a sip of my coffee and leaned against the cold granite island. The structural support holding up their lavish reality was gone. The trap was set. Now all I had to do was wait for the sun to rise, for the retail stores in Providence to open, and for the illusion to crash. It was 11 in the morning when the first domino tipped. My office on the 4th floor of the Regional Hospital Administration Building served as a sanctuary of order. Sunlight filtered through the slatted blinds, casting zebra stripes across my polished mahogany desk. The air smelled of sterile industrial cleaner and the mild peppermint tea brewing in my ceramic mug. I was reviewing a complex procurement contract for surgical supplies, my mind compartmentalized, operating with the cold efficiency that had built my career. The domestic strike I had executed at dawn felt miles away, locked behind a firewall of professional duty. Then, my personal cell phone vibrated against the wood surface. The screen illuminated, displaying Kelsey's name. I let the device buzz 3 times, savoring the rhythmic hum before tapping the accept button. Her voice erupted through the speaker, high-pitched and frantic, lacking any preamble or basic greeting. She was standing at the checkout counter of a designer boutique in downtown Providence, an enclave known for imported leather goods and exorbitant price tags. Her Platinum card had been declined. She demanded to know if there was a fraud alert holding up her purchase of a cashmere autumn coat. I could hear the muted jazz music of the retail store in the background, mixed with the hushed, polite murmurs of embarrassed sales associates. She sounded indignant, treating me not as a parent, but as a malfunctioning customer service representative holding up her day. I did not interrupt her frantic monologue. I let her spin out her frustration, listening to the entitlement crack and splinter over the cellular connection. When she finally paused to draw breath, instructing me to fix the glitch immediately, I kept my tone icy and perfectly level. I explained there was no glitch. I informed her that the account was closed. I reminded her of the restaurant the previous evening. I told her that since her father had publicly established I possessed no parental authority, I logically held no parental financial obligations either. She stuttered the reality of the situation, failing to compute in a brain wired for endless indulgence. She asked how she was supposed to pay for her luxury items. I suggested she ask the man who told me not to correct her. Then I ended the call. I placed the phone face down on the desk. A profound quiet settled over the room. I knew exactly what would happen next. I opened a hidden file on my desktop monitor, the spreadsheet I had compiled in the dark hours of the early morning. I sent the document to my private laser printer sitting in the corner of the suite. The machine whirred to life, spitting out 3 pages of itemized financial truth. The paper was still warm when I gathered the sheets, aligned the edges with a sharp tap on the wood, and stapled the top left corner. I placed the packet exactly in the center of my desk space. 20 minutes passed. The tension in the office thickened, heavy as impending coastal thunder. The heavy glass door to my suite swung open, hitting the rubber wall stop with a loud thud. Derek stormed inside. He had bypassed my executive assistant entirely, ignoring protocol and professional boundaries. His tailored suit jacket was unbuttoned, his silk tie slightly askew. The polished Newport broker persona had vanished, replaced by a man realizing his personal treasury was actively sinking. He planted both hands on the edge of my desk, leaning forward, invading my professional sanctuary. His chest heaved with exertion. He demanded I restore the credit lines this instant. He accused me of being petty, of acting like a vindictive roommate, of punishing a young girl over a harmless dinner table joke. His voice was thick with self-righteousness, projecting the blame entirely onto my shoulders. He played the role of the protective father, defending his offspring from a wicked stepmother. I did not flinch. I did not lean back in my ergonomic chair. I met his furious gaze with a steady, clinical stare. I reached out and rested my fingertips on the printed packet. I slid the crisp white pages across the smooth mahogany surface until they touched his white knuckles. I told him to look at the numbers. I explained that the sum represented his daughter's lifestyle, a lifestyle I would no longer subsidize. I clarified that I was not punishing anyone. I was simply resigning from a job I never applied for the role of, an unappreciated bank. Derek stared down at the itemized list. His eyes scanned the staggering total printed at the bottom of the page. His jaw clenched, a prominent muscle ticking wildly near his ear. The color drained from his cheeks as the mathematical reality of his situation set in. He realized his practiced charm would not work. He realized his physical intimidation was failing to produce fear. He stood up straight, stepping back from the desk, buttoning his jacket with jerky, uncoordinated movements. He pointed a trembling finger in my direction. He told me I was making a terrible mistake. He warned that I was destroying the very foundation of our marriage, claiming my stubbornness would ruin everything we had built. He tried to flip the narrative, framing my boundary as an act of senseless destruction. I remained silent, letting his threats hang in the sterile air. I offered no defense, no argument, no emotional reaction for him to feed upon. Realizing he had lost the battle for control in this room, he turned on his heel and marched out, leaving the heavy glass door ajar. His heavy footsteps echoed down the carpeted hallway, fading into the distance. I sat alone in the quiet office. I looked down at my hands resting in my lap. My fingers were trembling, vibrating with a fierce electric energy. For a fleeting second, I wondered if I had pushed too far. Then I recognized the sensation coursing through my veins. It was not fear. It was pure, unadulterated adrenaline. It was the physical manifestation of reclaiming my own agency. I realized I had finally stopped paying for the privilege of being diminished in my own life. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the cool air fill my lungs, savoring the victory. But as I reached for my cooling peppermint tea, my personal cell phone lit up again. The screen displayed an incoming call from his brother. The family network had been activated. The narrative was already being twisted, and the social retaliation was only just beginning. My phone illuminated again, buzzing against the polished wood of my desk. The caller identification displayed the name Bradley, my husband's older brother. Bradley managed a mid-sized commercial construction firm over in Warwick. He possessed the exact same polished, practiced charm as Derek, though he weaponized it in a different manner. Where Derek used charm to seduce and deflect, Bradley used it to build consensus and corner his targets. I stared at the glowing screen for a long moment. I knew taking the call was a tactical error, but part of me needed to hear exactly how fast the narrative was being spun. I dragged my finger across the glass and accepted the connection. Bradley did not ask how my morning was going. He bypassed any standard greeting and launched right into a rehearsed script. His voice dripped with a manufactured heavy concern, the kind reserved for mourning a sudden tragedy. He told me Derek had just called him, sounding broken and desperate. Within a single hour, my husband had activated his family network, deploying his relatives to bring his rogue wife back into line. Bradley painted a vivid, pathetic picture. He described Kelsey crying in the dressing room of a Providence boutique, humiliated in front of her peers and retail staff because her stepmother decided to throw a random temper tantrum. He called her a kid. He leaned hard on that word, stretching it out, trying to trigger my maternal instincts. He reminded me that she was just a vulnerable college student trying to find her way in the world. Then, with subtle, slicing precision, he shifted the focus to me. He framed me as the wealthy, calculating healthcare executive sitting in my plush corporate office, wielding my substantial bank account to punish a defenseless young girl over a harmless misunderstanding. I sat back in my ergonomic chair and listened to his monologue. I heard the underlying resentment threading through his words. I recognized the subtle digs at my career, my historic home, and my financial independence. Bradley suggested that because I had so much, I was obligated to give freely to those who had less, namely his brother and his niece. He told me I was overreacting, that I needed to calm down, restore the credit lines, and apologize to Derek for causing such unnecessary drama. I realized in that moment how effectively Derek had laid the groundwork for this smear campaign. He had cast himself as the hard-working, stressed father, and me as the cold, stingy villain. Explaining my side of the story to Bradley would be a profound waste of breath. You cannot defend your boundaries to people who directly benefit from you having none. They do not want to understand your pain. They only want to restore their convenience. Bradley paused, waiting for my tearful surrender. Instead, I kept my voice flat and void of any emotion. I told him my financial decisions were a private matter between a husband and a wife, not a subject for a family committee vote. Before he could launch into another guilt trip, I ended the call and placed the device back on my desk. Despite my outward calm, the psychological toll of the gaslighting was beginning to take root. The silence in my office felt heavier. A creeping whisper of doubt snaked into my mind. I wondered if I truly was being too harsh. I needed a tether to reality, an anchor to keep me from drifting into their distorted version of events. I picked up the phone and dialed my son. Connor was 28 years old, working as a civil engineer just across the river. I had raised him alone after his father passed away, surviving on strict budgets, sheer willpower, and endless cups of cheap coffee. Connor put himself through engineering school by working late shifts at a warehouse. He possessed a practical, unsentimental view of the world, forged by watching his mother earn every single dollar she spent. When he answered on the second ring, I did not cry. I laid out the raw facts. I told him about the dinner at Coastline Prime. I detailed the insult, the wrist grab, the morning audit, and the canceled cards. I told him about Derek storming into my office and Bradley calling to twist the knife. I braced myself, waiting for my son to tell me I had pushed things too far. Instead, Connor let out a dry, knowing laugh. The sound instantly broke the tension tightening my chest. He reminded me of a truth I had buried deep beneath my desire for a successful second marriage. He pointed out that Derek had always treated my generosity like a built-in entitlement rather than a gift. Connor recounted small moments I had brushed off. Derek ordering the most expensive wine at dinners and waiting for me to hand the waiter my card. Kelsey treating my home like a luxury hotel, where she never had to empty a dishwasher or pay for her own laundry detergent. Connor validated my reality. He told me I was not losing my mind. He said I was not being cruel or petty. "Mom," he said, his voice dropping into a serious, steady cadence, "you didn't overreact today. You underreacted. For 2 years, you are just finally seeing the scam for what it is." That brief conversation functioned as a steel rod reinforcing my spine. The lingering doubt evaporated, replaced by a cold operational focus. I thanked him, ended the call, and packed my leather briefcase. I could not concentrate on hospital procurement contracts anymore. I needed to go home and secure my territory. I left the office early and drove back to South Kingstown. The Victorian house stood quiet under an overcast, bruising afternoon sky. The sprawling lawn and the wide wraparound porch usually brought me peace, but today they just felt like assets I needed to protect. I unlocked the front door and walked straight down the main hallway toward Derek's home office. The room was a curated shrine to his Newport broker persona. Model sailboats with pristine white canvas sails lined the dark mahogany shelves. Framed vintage nautical maps decorated the walls, authenticating a maritime legacy he did not actually possess. The air smelled of stale cedar and his signature expensive cologne. I walked over to the heavy oak filing cabinets tucked into the corner. I needed to separate my life from his. I needed to pull my tax returns, my property deeds, and my individual investment portfolios, physically removing them from his convoluted business ledgers. I opened the bottom drawer, sorting through thick manila folders. I pulled out my insurance policies, checking the beneficiaries, ensuring my son was listed everywhere. As I dug deeper into the back of the cabinet, reaching beneath a stack of expired maritime warranties, my fingers brushed against a piece of thick, glossy cardstock. It felt out of place among the dry legal documents. I pulled the item out into the light. It was a high-end travel brochure printed on heavy, expensive paper. The cover displayed a breathtaking, sun-drenched photograph of the Amalfi Coast. Vibrant turquoise water crashed against towering cliffs dotted with pastel-colored villas. I opened the thick pamphlet. Inside, a yellow sticky note rested on a page advertising luxury private rentals and exclusive chartered yacht excursions. The dates, circled in bright blue ink, matched our upcoming second wedding anniversary perfectly. A strange, treacherous warmth blossomed in my chest. The human mind is wired to seek patterns of survival to find a lifeline when tossed into the middle of a raging storm. I stared at the vibrant blue ink, and a very dangerous thought took shape in the quiet room. I knew Derek had been complaining about severe financial strain for weeks. I knew he was stressed, missing appointments, acting erratic. What if his intense defensiveness, his desperate need for control, and his wild reaction in my office were all the byproduct of a man trying to pull off a grand romantic gesture? What if he was secretly drowning in debt, trying to finance this European dream vacation to fix the growing distance between us? For a fleeting, agonizing second, the icy armor I had constructed that morning began to thaw. I traced the circled dates on the sticky note. I felt a sudden, sharp wave of hope wash over me. I thought, perhaps I had misjudged the depth of his deception. Maybe, beneath the entitlement and the ego, there was a man who genuinely wanted to celebrate our marriage. Maybe his anger today was just the panic of a ruined surprise. But the tragedy of hope is that it softens your defenses right before the real devastation strikes. It lowers your shield, so the next blow hits the vital organs. I took a deep breath, fighting the tears burning the corners of my eyes, wanting so badly to believe the beautiful Italian fantasy printed on the page. I set the brochure gently on the edge of the desk, Then I reached back into the drawer and pulled out the thick leather binder resting directly beneath where the brochure had been hidden. It was the ledger for our joint savings account, the one we opened together to build a safety net for Kelsey's senior year. I flipped open the heavy cover, expecting to find the funds that would prove his romantic intent, completely unaware that the numbers waiting on the very first page were about to shatter my world. The leather binder felt heavy in my hands. The Amalfi Coast brochure still sat on the edge of the mahogany desk, its pastel-colored promise radiating a desperate kind of warmth. I opened the thick ledger, the brass rings snapping apart with a sharp, metallic click. Inside were the printed monthly statements for the joint savings account Derek and I had established the previous spring. We had named it the URI Tuition Reserve. I funded it primarily with my year-end executive bonus, intending it to serve as a designated safety net to guarantee Kelsey would finish her senior year without accumulating toxic student debt. I ran my index finger down the final column of the most recent paper statement. The balance, printed in bold black ink, was robust. Reassured, I almost closed the binder. I almost let the beautiful Italian fantasy win. But 30 years of managing healthcare logistics had trained my brain to trust verification over hope. A paper statement from 3 weeks ago only told a historical truth, not a present reality. I sat down in Derek's leather office chair. It swallowed me, smelling of stale cedar and the expensive scotch he liked to sip while making client calls. I opened the web browser on the desktop monitor, navigating to our banking portal. I typed in the shared credentials. The screen refreshed, pulling up the live digital dashboard for the reserve account. My breath caught in my throat. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. The available balance displayed in the top right corner was not robust. It was a mere fraction of what it should have been. A cavernous void had been carved out of the ledger. I gripped the edge of the desk, my knuckles turning white against the dark wood. I clicked on the recent transaction history, my eyes scanning the descending rows of data. There it was. An outgoing electronic wire transfer dated 19 days prior. The amount was $45,000. The memo line read, "URI Tuition Reserve," mimicking the name of the account to look like a standard academic disbursement. But I knew the standard university billing cycle. The bursar did not require a lump sum of that magnitude in the middle of October. I clicked on the confirmation details, expanding the electronic receipt. I scrutinized the routing digits and the destination institution. The receiving bank was not a regional educational credit union. It was a commercial financial institution, headquartered in downtown Newport. I memorized the routing prefix and opened a new tab querying the public banking registry. The search results loaded instantly. The destination was an operating account registered to Newport Brokerage. Derek had not wired the money to his daughter's university. He had wired $45,000 of my hard-earned savings directly into his own failing boat business. The Amalfi Coast brochure suddenly looked like a mocking joke. There was no romantic European vacation planned. There was no grand gesture hiding behind his erratic behavior. He was not a stressed father trying to keep his family afloat. He was a con artist, using my checking account as a life raft for his sinking maritime facade. A cold, creeping nausea settled into my stomach as I traced the timeline backward. 19 days ago. I pulled out my cell phone and opened my digital calendar, scrolling back to that specific Thursday. A vivid, sickening memory materialized in the quiet office. That was the afternoon my sister Joanne experienced a sudden, severe allergic reaction. I had rushed to Rhode Island Hospital, sitting in the emergency room waiting area for 4 agonizing hours while the physicians stabilized her breathing. I was frantic, pacing the sterile linoleum floors, clutching my phone. Derek had driven to the hospital to keep me company. He brought me a lukewarm coffee from the cafeteria. He rubbed my shoulders. He played the role of the devoted, supportive husband flawlessly. While I was distracted speaking with the attending physician in the hallway, Derek had volunteered to call my assistant to clear my afternoon schedule. He asked to borrow my laptop, claiming his phone battery was dead. I had handed him the silver machine without a second thought, my mind entirely consumed by my sister's health. He sat in the corner of an emergency room waiting area, surrounded by human suffering, and used my saved passwords to drain $45,000 from a college fund. He siphoned the money while I was crying over Joanne's hospital bed. The depth of the betrayal was so profound, it bypassed anger entirely. What I felt sitting in his office was a hollow, paralyzing grief. I mourned the death of the man I thought I had married. The charming yacht broker who remembered my coffee order and talked about building a legacy was nothing more than a well-dressed parasite. Every kind gesture, every heated towel waiting for me after a shower, every glass of wine poured on the back porch, it was all tactical. It was all a calculated performance designed to keep the host compliant while he quietly extracted the resources he needed to maintain his fake Gilded Age lifestyle. My marriage was a functional fraud. The vows we exchanged were just the opening lines of a financial transaction he intended to win. I did not weep. Tears are a biological response designed to solicit comfort, and there was no one in this house who would comfort me. Instead, my grief crystallized into a sharp, unforgiving focus. I right-clicked on the wire transfer confirmation screen. I hit print. The laser machine hummed to life, generating the physical evidence of his theft. I printed the commercial routing details, the date, and the digital signature he had forged using my credentials. The crisp white pages slid into the output tray, warm to the touch. I opened a desk drawer and found a pristine, unmarked manila folder. I placed the documents inside, aligning the edges until they formed a perfect, uniform stack. I closed the folder and rested my hand on top of it. The stakes had fundamentally shifted. This morning, I thought I was dealing with a disrespectful husband and an entitled stepdaughter. I thought I was simply establishing a boundary against financial exploitation. Now I knew the terrifying truth. I was sleeping in the same bed as a thief. A man desperate enough to steal from a college fund during a medical crisis was capable of much worse. I needed to confront him. I needed to look him in the eye and watch the Newport facade crumble. But I also knew I needed to be strategic. A cornered animal is unpredictable, and Derek's ego was a fragile, dangerous thing. I picked up the manila folder and my leather briefcase, turning to leave the office. As I walked down the main hallway toward the kitchen, my cell phone vibrated again. I assumed it was another flying monkey from his family tree, ready to read from the prepared script. I glanced at the screen. It was an incoming email from the Chief of Human Resources at my hospital network. The subject line was flagged as urgent, requesting an immediate phone call regarding a sensitive personnel matter. I answered the phone standing in the foyer of my historic home. The Human Resources Director cleared her throat, sounding deeply uncomfortable. She asked if I was in a safe place to talk. She then proceeded to tell me that my husband had just called the hospital administration line. Derek had spoken to the Vice President of Operations, expressing deep, tearful concern about my recent erratic behavior. He had planted a very specific seed. He told my employers that I was experiencing severe cognitive decline, warning them that I might be suffering from early-onset dementia. The breath left my lungs. Derek was not just stealing my money. He was actively destroying my professional sanity to ensure that when the theft was discovered, no one would believe a single word I said. I stood rooted to the hardwood floor of my foyer, the cell phone pressed tight against my ear. The voice of my hospital network's human resources director echoed through the receiver, dripping with professional sympathy. She used phrases like proactive wellness and supportive leave structures. I listened as she detailed the phone call she had received just 20 minutes prior. Derek had played the devastated spouse to perfection. He had called my corporate superiors under the guise of seeking medical advice, claiming he was terrified by my recent cognitive decline. He told them I was experiencing sudden paranoia, accusing him of stealing, and forgetting basic financial procedures. He painted a tragic portrait of early-onset dementia. My mind raced, connecting the scattered puzzle pieces of the last 3 months. I thought about the misplaced Audi keys sitting next to the milk carton. I remembered the lost tax documents and the missed maritime meetings. Those were not accidents. Those were not the byproduct of economic stress. Derek had been actively curating a catalog of cognitive failures, a designated list of symptoms he planned to project onto me the moment I uncovered his financial crimes. It was a staggering display of predatory foresight. By warning my colleagues that I was becoming paranoid and financially unstable, he ensured that any accusation I leveled against him would be dismissed as a tragic symptom of a dying mind. I thanked the Human Resources Director, keeping my diction crisp and my tone perfectly steady. I assured her there was a significant misunderstanding and promised to schedule a formal meeting the following morning. I ended the connection and lowered the device. The quiet of my Victorian home suddenly felt suffocating, like a cage closing around me. I needed fresh air. I walked out onto the wraparound porch, stepping into the damp Rhode Island afternoon. A thick fog was rolling in off Narragansett Bay, turning the sky a bruised shade of gray. As I descended the front steps to retrieve the day's mail, a silver sedan pulled up to the edge of my driveway. The window rolled down to reveal my neighbor, a retired orthodontist named Howard, who lived 3 houses down the street. Howard was a fixture in the local yacht club scene, the exact demographic Derek courted for his brokerage. Howard offered a sad, pitying smile. It was the specific facial expression reserved for terminal diagnoses and tragic accidents. He turned off his engine and leaned out the window. He told me Derek had confided in him during a round of golf the previous weekend. Howard lowered his voice to a hushed whisper, saying the whole neighborhood was praying for my health. He gently suggested that if I ever felt confused or wandered away from the property, I could always knock on his door. He promised they would keep an eye on me. A sharp, freezing dread washed over my skin. The smear campaign was not just a localized strike at my office. Derek had seeded the lie throughout our entire social ecosystem. He had weaponized the local Rhode Island gossip mill, a notoriously efficient machine. From the hospital boardroom to the country club greens, the narrative was already calcifying into truth. Poor Alicia Lane, the brilliant healthcare executive losing her mind before her 54th birthday. Poor Derek, the loyal, handsome husband burdened with caring for a deteriorating wife. I thanked Howard, maintaining a rigid posture, and walked back up the porch steps. My pristine reputation, the credibility I had spent 3 decades forging through late nights and flawless audits, was dissolving in real time. I returned to the kitchen and stared at the manila folder resting on the granite island. A realization settled over me, heavy and cold. The situational landscape had fundamentally shifted. 2 hours ago, I thought I could simply present the evidence of the stolen $45,000, file the divorce paperwork, and execute a quiet, clean separation. I thought I could cut my losses and expel him from my property. That was no longer an option. If I left the marriage quietly now, the false narrative would follow me forever. Derek would keep the stolen funds, playing the victim, claiming I mismanaged the accounts in a state of mental confusion. My career would be quietly phased out by a board of directors terrified of executive liability. I would lose my livelihood, my social standing, and my sanity, all while the real thief sailed away on a sea of public sympathy. I was backed into a corner. I could not simply defend myself. I had to go on the offensive. I picked up my leather briefcase, sliding the manila folder inside. I grabbed my car keys and walked out to the garage. I did not drive back to the hospital. I steered my vehicle onto the interstate heading north toward Providence. I needed an ally who operated outside the boundaries of polite society, someone who understood the dark, tactical maneuvers of a cornered narcissist. 40 minutes later, I walked into the downtown office of Victor Thorne. Victor was a seasoned family law attorney, known throughout the state for his surgical ruthlessness. He did not advertise on park benches or television screens. He operated via quiet referrals, specializing in dismantling the high society phonies who populated the state's affluent coastal towns. His office lacked the pretentious mahogany trappings of his peers, featuring stark modern lines and sweeping glass windows that overlooked the Providence River. I sat across from his desk and pulled the manila folder from my briefcase. I did not offer a tearful preamble. I did not ask for pity. I laid out the crisp, printed pages detailing the routed transfer. I explained the timeline of the hospital waiting room. Then I detailed the phone calls from my boss and the conversation with my neighbor. I handed him the blueprint of my husband's psychological warfare. Victor studied the banking documents, tracing the forged digital signature with a silver pen. He leaned back in his chair, evaluating me with sharp, calculating eyes. He did not offer empty comfort. He offered strategy. He explained that we were no longer just preparing for a standard dissolution of marriage. We were preparing for a high-stakes defamation and fraud war. He told me that Derek's preemptive strike was clever, but it contained a fatal flaw. By introducing the concept of cognitive decline into the public sphere, Derek had inadvertently opened the door for a full forensic accounting of all marital assets to determine competency. My attorneys sketched out a brutal, methodical battle plan. We would not send a warning letter. We would not alert Derek to the impending legal storm. We would let him continue spinning his web of lies, gathering every digital footprint, every text message, and every voicemail where he peddled the dementia narrative. We would let him feel victorious. I drove back to South Kingstown as the evening shadows stretched across the highway. The fog had thickened, obscuring the ocean horizon. I felt a strange sense of equilibrium returning to my chest. The paralyzing grief I experienced earlier in the day had been entirely replaced by a potent, focused endurance. I pulled into my driveway and stared at the illuminated windows of my historic home. Derek's car was parked in the garage. He was inside, undoubtedly pouring himself a glass of expensive scotch, congratulating himself on a brilliantly executed trap. He thought he had neutralized the threat. He believed his psychological warfare had rendered me helpless. He had no idea I was walking through the front door, carrying a loaded, legal weapon, ready to match his charm with cold, unyielding arithmetic. I gripped the handle of my briefcase, stepped onto the porch, and turned the key in the lock, preparing for the kitchen confrontation. I stepped over the threshold of my home, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind me, sealing out the damp coastal fog. The entryway smelled of roasted garlic, rosemary, and expensive bourbon. Derek was standing at the kitchen island, holding a crystal tumbler filled with amber liquid and a single large sphere of ice. He wore a crisp white button-down shirt, the sleeves casually rolled up to the elbows, projecting the effortless ease of a man without a single worry in the world. He was listening to a low-volume jazz playlist, humming along while stirring a simmering pot of marinara sauce on the stove. It was a picture-perfect domestic scene, curated to perfection to disarm any incoming hostility. I walked into the kitchen, the heels of my leather boots clicking against the polished hardwood floor. I carried my briefcase by my side, the weight of the printed bank statements pulling down on my shoulder. Derek turned toward me, a bright, practiced smile spreading across his handsome face. He raised his glass in a silent toast, asking how my afternoon at the hospital had been, acting as though the morning conflict in my office had never occurred. He was compartmentalizing, a survival tactic used by predators, to reset the emotional game board, forcing their victims to either conform to the pleasant illusion or bear the guilt of ruining a peaceful evening. I did not return the smile. I set my briefcase on a nearby dining chair, popped the brass clasps, and extracted the manila folder. I walked over to the granite island, stopping directly across from him. I placed the folder on the cold stone surface. I slid it forward until the leading edge touched the base of his crystal tumbler. The ice inside his glass clinked against the rim. He looked down at the plain cardboard cover, his brow furrowing in feigned confusion. "Open it," I said. My voice was a flat, clinical instrument. He set his drink aside, wiping a stray drop of condensation from his thumb, and flipped back the cover. I watched his eyes scan the printed routing details, the date of the transaction, and the staggering numeric value transferred from the university reserve into his commercial operating account. I waited for the panic. I expected the color to drain from his face, perhaps a stuttered excuse or a frantic denial. Instead, Derek performed a masterful psychological pivot. He let out a long, slow sigh, shaking his head with a condescending chuckle. He closed the folder, tapped the top of it with his index finger, and looked at me with an expression of profound, patronizing pity. He did not apologize. He did not beg for forgiveness. He leaned against the counter, crossed his arms over his chest, and began to weave a tapestry of sheer fiction. He called the transaction a simple, routine bridge loan. He spoke in smooth, measured tones, utilizing the cadence of a seasoned financial advisor, explaining a basic concept to an anxious novice. He claimed the Newport maritime market was experiencing an unexpected seasonal slump, a temporary dip in luxury yacht acquisitions due to fluctuating interest rates. His brokerage, he insisted, merely needed a brief infusion of liquid capital to cover overhead costs until two major pending sales cleared escrow. He promised the funds would be fully restored long before the spring tuition deadline arrived, framing the theft as a responsible strategic maneuver to protect our overall household wealth. Then came the pivot from defense to offense. He lowered his voice, adopting the exact tone of gentle concern he had likely used with the human resources director a few hours earlier. He asked why I was digging through old banking portals instead of focusing on my demanding job. He used the word snooping, painting my forensic discovery as a breach of marital trust. He tilted his head, his eyes widening with feigned worry, and told me that my recent behavior was becoming incredibly erratic. He suggested that my intense, paranoid fixation on our finances was a troubling sign. "You are getting confused, Alicia," he murmured, stepping closer, reaching out as if to comfort me. "You are mixing up accounts, forgetting the conversations we had about my business strategy. We talked about this transfer weeks ago, remember? You agreed it was the smartest move. I know you have been under an immense amount of stress at the hospital, but this sudden paranoia is really concerning. We need to get you checked out by a specialist." He was lying to my face, attempting to rewrite history in real time. We had never discussed a bridge loan. I had never authorized the withdrawal. He was actively injecting the dementia narrative directly into my own home, testing the boundaries of my reality, trying to make me doubt my own pristine memory. He wanted me to argue. He wanted me to scream, to cry, to hurl the crystal glass against the tile wall. If I reacted with fury, he could point to my emotional outburst as definitive proof of my declining mental stability. A hysterical woman is easily dismissed, her valid accusations written off as the tragic ravings of a broken mind. I stood frozen, analyzing the precise mechanics of his manipulation. Arguing with a narcissist is like trying to extinguish a fire by pouring gasoline on the flames. They thrive on the chaotic energy of the conflict. They do not care about the truth, they only care about control. If I presented logical arguments, he would simply invent new lies. If I demanded accountability, he would play the victim, claiming I was persecuting a hard-working husband trying his best to provide for his family. His charm and his boundless capacity for deception were weapons he used to slip out of any trap, leaving the person who caught him feeling guilty for ever suspecting foul play. I recognized that words would never defeat him. The printed paper inside the folder was a start, but it was not enough to counter the elaborate web of deceit he was spinning throughout Rhode Island. The bridge loan lie would be his official defense if I took him to court tomorrow. He would bring in fraudulent ledgers, testify with tears in his eyes, and lean on the gossip of my cognitive decline to sway a judge. I needed something he could not talk his way out of. I needed a structural collapse so profound his charm would be rendered entirely useless. I did not raise my voice. I did not dispute his fabricated memory of a prior conversation. I simply reached across the granite counter and placed my hand over the manila folder. I pulled it back toward my chest, removing it from his sphere of influence. Derek's confident smile faltered for a fraction of a second. My silence unnerved him. He knew how to handle a screaming wife, but a silent, calculating opponent disturbed his script. He asked me what I was doing, his tone losing a tiny measure of its smooth veneer. I told him I was going to change out of my work clothes. I turned my back on him walking out of the kitchen, taking the evidence with me. I climbed the central staircase, my mind operating with cold, terrifying precision. The confrontation had fueled my resolve, burning away any lingering traces of grief. He thought he had outsmarted me with his bridge loan excuse and his patronizing concern. He thought the game was over, assuming I would retreat upstairs to question my own sanity. I entered the master bedroom, locking the heavy wooden door behind me. I set the folder on my nightstand. The path forward was crystalline. I had to let him continue his performance. I had to give him enough rope to hang his own reputation. I needed undeniable, irrefutable proof of his ongoing fraud, evidence that required no explanation and left no room for reasonable doubt. I needed to dig into the deepest, darkest corners of his commercial dealings and find the rot hidden beneath the Gilded Age facade. I sat on the edge of the mattress, pulling out my cell phone to draft a secure message to my attorney. I was formulating a plan to audit the deed to this very house, determined to lock down every single asset bearing my name. But before my fingers could type the first sentence, a sharp, frantic pounding echoed from the ground floor. Someone was hammering their fists against the heavy oak of the front door. The rapid rhythm cutting through the quiet coastal evening. The noise was raw, desperate, and impossible to ignore, signaling that a brand new storm had just washed up onto my front porch. The frantic pounding, rattling the glass panes of my front door echoed all the way up the central staircase. I paused in the hallway of the second floor, my pulse steadying into a calm, rhythmic thrum. The hum of the garage motor opening just minutes prior, followed by the crunch of tires on wet pavement, told me Derek had retreated into the coastal fog. He often fled to the local country club when a manipulation attempt failed to produce immediate results, seeking the validation of his peers to soothe his bruised ego. The house was empty. Whoever was hammering against the heavy oak entry was alone with me. I descended the stairs, my leather boots silent on the plush carpet runner. I reached the foyer, unlocked the deadbolt, and pulled the door open. Kelsey stood under the amber glow of the porch light. The damp Rhode Island chill had tangled her blonde hair, and her expensive designer trench coat was splattered with dark rain droplets. She did not look like the confident, smirking girl who had toasted to my financial subjugation at Coastline Prime. She looked feral. She clutched a crumpled piece of heavy stock paper in her right fist, her knuckles white with strain. Before I could offer a greeting, she pushed past me, stepping onto the polished hardwood in her wet boots. She spun around, raising the crumpled paper like a weapon. "It is an administrative hold," she said, her voice shaking with raw, unfiltered fury. "The university bursar sent it via certified mail. I cannot register for my final semester. I am locked out of the student portal. I cannot even access my meal plan." I closed the front door, sealing out the harsh weather. I leaned against the sturdy wood, watching her chest heave. I did not interrupt. "My dad told me what is happening to you," she continued, her tone laced with a toxic mixture of fear and entitlement. "He said you are sick. He said you are losing your memory and becoming paranoid, making up crazy stories about his business. I thought he was just exaggerating. But you really are losing your mind. You cut off my tuition because you are having a breakdown." She took a step closer, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. "If you do not fix this by tomorrow morning, I am going to ruin you," she threatened. "I will call the hospital board myself. I will post it on every social media channel in South Kingstown. I will tell all your fancy corporate friends that the great Alicia Lane is suffering from early onset dementia and hoarding family money like a lunatic. I will make sure everyone knows you are sick." She stood there, breathing heavy, waiting for me to shatter. She expected the threat of public humiliation to break my resolve. She was employing the exact same psychological warfare her father used, a learned behavior passed down from predator to offspring. I looked at the crumpled university notice in her fist. Then I looked at her eyes. Beneath the venom and the practiced arrogance, I saw the distinct panic of a young woman who had never been denied a single comfort in her entire life, suddenly staring at the edge of a cliff. She believed her father. She believed I was the villain holding her future hostage. I pushed away from the door. "Follow me," I said, my voice quiet and void of any inflection. I walked into the formal dining room, a space dominated by a long mahogany table. I reached into my leather briefcase, resting on the nearby credenza. I extracted the manila folder containing the bank transfers, along with a secondary envelope delivered by courier from my attorney just before I left the office that afternoon. I laid both items flat on the polished wood surface. I gestured for her to step closer. Kelsey approached the table with cautious, jerky steps. She glared at me, suspicious of the silence. I opened the manila folder. I tapped the printed routing confirmation, showing the withdrawal of $45,000. "That is the account I established to pay your tuition," I explained, keeping my words sharp and factual. "Look at the date. Look at the destination. Your father drained that reserve 19 days ago. He wired the cash into his commercial operating account to keep his failing luxury boat brokerage from filing for bankruptcy. I did not trigger your administrative hold. He did." Kelsey stared at the bold black digits. Her brow furrowed, her brain struggling to process empirical evidence that directly contradicted the reality she had been spoon-fed. She shook her head, a reflexive denial. "You forged this," she whispered, her voice losing its venomous edge. "You printed a fake document because you are paranoid. My dad said you were making things up." I anticipated the denial. I reached for the secondary envelope provided by Victor Thorne. My attorney had conducted a preliminary forensic sweep of Derek's historical assets, digging into the archives of his previous marriage. I slid a new stack of documents out of the thick paper sleeve. "I do not expect you to trust me," I said gently, "but numbers do not suffer from dementia, and numbers do not lie." I laid the new papers next to the commercial transfer. They were custodial banking records. I knew the history of Kelsey's biological mother. She had passed away when Kelsey was just 7 years old, leaving behind a modest but secure life insurance policy and a dedicated custodial trust meant to vest when her daughter turned 21. The funds were explicitly designated to provide a safety net for her transition into adulthood. "Look at the ledger," I instructed, stepping back to give her physical space. Kelsey leaned over the table. Her eyes tracked the descending columns of data. The custodial account had contained $75,000 on her 18th birthday. The subsequent pages chronicled a devastating story of quiet, methodical extraction. 5,000 here, 10,000 there. Transfers marked as educational expenses that never matched the university billing cycles. Withdrawals categorized as medical emergencies that never occurred. The final page displayed the current available balance. 0. I watched the exact moment the illusion cracked. It was a physical transformation. The rigid, entitled posture holding her upright seemed to snap. Her shoulders slumped forward. The crumpled, administrative hold slipped from her fingers, fluttering to the floor like a dead leaf. She reached out with a trembling hand, tracing the final zero on the custodial statement. He took it, she breathed, the realization suffocating her. My mom left that for me. He promised it was growing in an investment portfolio. He promised I would have it after graduation. He took it, I confirmed. He used your mother's legacy to fund his lifestyle. And when that well ran dry, he found a new source of revenue. Me. A profound, heavy silence settled over the dining room. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway sounded like a hammer striking an anvil. Kelsey did not scream. She did not throw a tantrum. The fiery rage of a spoiled child evaporated, replaced by the hollow, crushing devastation of a betrayed daughter. The man who had trained her to view kindness as a weakness, the man who had instructed me not to correct her, had been silently bleeding her dry for years. Tears spilled over her lower lashes, cutting tracks through her expensive makeup. She pressed her palms against her eyes, a quiet sob tearing from her throat. In that moment, the dynamic between us underwent a fundamental shift. We were no longer warring factions in a blended family dispute. We were no longer the wicked stepmother and the ungrateful princess. We were simply two women, standing in a quiet house, surveying the wreckage caused by the exact same con man. I did not feel a shred of vindication. I did not feel the urge to gloat or remind her of the cruel toast she made at the restaurant. I only felt a deep, echoing empathy. We shared the same specific wound, the trauma of realizing our trust had been weaponized against us. I walked past her, heading into the kitchen. I retrieved 2 ceramic mugs from the cabinet. I poured fresh, dark roast coffee, adding a splash of cream to hers, remembering her preference from the rare weekend mornings we used to share in this house. I carried the warm mugs back to the dining room. I set one down near her elbow. "Drink," I murmured. She lowered her hands, her face blotchy and pale. She picked up the mug, wrapping both hands around the heated ceramic, letting the warmth anchor her shivering frame. She took a slow sip. We stood side by side in the dim light, drinking our coffee in a somber, unspoken alliance. The smoking rubble of Derek's elaborate deception lay scattered across the mahogany table. I knew the battle was far from over. Revealing the truth to Kelsey neutralized one of his most potent weapons, stripping away his ability to use his daughter as a shield. But the envelope from Victor Thorne contained one final tab, a document separated by a bright red paperclip. As Kelsey stared blankly out the window, processing her grief, I flipped open the last page of the legal dossier. My attorney had warned me that a desperate man leaves a trail of reckless mistakes. I scanned the dense legal jargon printed on the page, my eyes zeroing in on a pending application submitted to a regional lending institution. The blood froze in my veins. The financial theft was merely the prologue. Derek had escalated his operations, stepping over the line of simple embezzlement and diving straight into criminal forgery. The discovery printed on that page meant the ticking clock counting down to my financial ruin had just accelerated, and the roof, currently shielding us from the coastal storm, was no longer safe. The red paperclip gleamed under the dining room chandelier. Kelsey sat beside me, her hands wrapped around the cooling ceramic mug, her gaze fixed on the empty trust fund statements. She was lost in a private mourning. I left her to process the betrayal and picked up the final document provided by my attorney. The thick parchment felt unusually heavy. Before I could read the first paragraph, my cell phone vibrated against the mahogany table. The screen displayed the name Victor Thorne. Calling a client after business hours was not a common practice for a high-powered Providence lawyer. I answered the call, pressing the speaker against my ear, and walked out of the dining room into the quiet hallway. Victor did not bother with pleasantries. He possessed a voice like dry gravel, sharp and direct. He told me his forensic accountant had just finished a preliminary sweep of the public property records in Washington County. They were looking for hidden asset transfers. What they found instead was a rejected lending application. My breath caught. I asked him to explain. Victor detailed the discovery with chilling precision. 3 weeks ago, roughly around the same time Derek drained the university reserve, a lending application had been submitted to a regional bank headquartered in Warwick. The application was for a home equity line of credit. The collateral listed on the paperwork was my historic Victorian house in South Kingstown. The requested draw was for an exorbitant sum, enough cash to pull the equity right out of the walls and leave the property heavily mortgaged. I leaned against the hallway wall. The cold plaster seeped through my silk blouse. I bought this house 7 years ago. I saved every bonus, skipped vacations, and worked double shifts managing hospital logistics just to afford the down payment. The stained glass windows, the wraparound porch, the original pine floors, they were the physical manifestation of my independence. Derek had moved into a fully furnished, debt-free sanctuary. He contributed nothing to the mortgage. Now he was trying to leverage the roof over my head to generate cash for himself. I asked Victor how such a filing was even possible. I am the sole owner of the property. My name is the only one on the deed. Victor explained the mechanics of the crime. Derek operates in the affluent circles of the Rhode Island maritime industry. He sells luxury yachts, dealing with offshore accounts, wealthy buyers, and private financiers. He possesses a vast network of transactional contacts. He utilized that network to locate a corrupt notary public. This individual, likely someone who owed Derek a favor or wanted a kickback, stamped and sealed the official loan documents without verifying my identity. They bypassed the strict security protocols designed to prevent this exact scenario. Derek forged my signature. He copied the loops and slants of my handwriting, signed a binding legal document, and submitted it to the bank. He committed a felony. I closed my eyes, a wave of profound nausea rolling through my stomach. The interpersonal disrespect at the restaurant felt like a distant memory. The theft of the tuition funds, while devastating, was an exploitation of shared marital access. But forging my signature to mortgage my home crossed a terrifying threshold. He was not a desperate businessman making poor choices under pressure. He was a predator. I asked Victor why the loan did not process. If the notary sealed the document, the funds should have dispersed. A stroke of pure luck, Victor replied. A meticulous branch manager at the Warwick Lending Institution reviewed the final paperwork before authorizing the wire. This manager compared the wet signature on the application to a digitized signature card from a car loan I paid off a decade ago. The manager noticed a slight discrepancy in the way the letter A was crossed. It was a minor imperfection, the kind most automated systems would miss, but the human eye caught it. The bank flagged the file for identity verification and placed a temporary freeze on the application. If that manager had been tired, or rushed, or simply careless, the loan would have funded. If I had waited a few more months to audit my accounts, if I had continued to play the role of the quiet, accommodating wife, I would have woken up one morning to find a crushing lien attached to my property. The realization landed like a heavy boulder on my chest. Derek was willing to render me homeless to maintain his illusion of wealth. I thanked Victor for the update. My voice sounded distant, as if it belonged to someone else. I asked what our next legal maneuver should be. Victor instructed me to remain silent. We now possessed proof of criminal forgery. This evidence elevated our strategy from a simple divorce proceeding to a high-stakes fraud case. But Victor warned me not to confront Derek with this new information. If Derek realized he was facing potential federal charges, he would panic. A cornered predator is dangerous. He might attempt to destroy documents, empty remaining accounts, or escalate his smear campaign to portray me as a vindictive liar trying to frame him. Play the long game, Alicia, my attorney advised. Let him believe his bridge loan excuse worked. Let him think you are just a frustrated wife. We need to secure the perimeter before we drop the cage. I agreed and ended the call. The hallway felt too narrow, the air too thin. I walked back into the dining room. Kelsey was still sitting at the table, her hands resting flat on the wood. She looked up as I entered. Her eyes were red, swollen from crying, but a new, harder light shone in her pupils. She asked what was wrong. She said I looked like I had seen a ghost. I sat down across from her. I decided not to burden her with the notary forgery just yet. She was already struggling to process the theft of her mother's trust fund. Handing her the knowledge that her father was a felon might break her fragile composure, and I needed her steady. Just a call from my lawyer, I murmured, offering a reassuring nod. We are uncovering the full extent of the damage. Kelsey traced the rim of her coffee mug. She took a slow, shuddering breath. I do not understand why he needs all this cash, she whispered. He sells yachts. He makes great commissions. He always brags about his closing bonuses. Why would he steal my trust fund and your savings? It does not make any mathematical sense. Her question pierced through the fog of my own shock. She was right. The Newport maritime market was lucrative. Even in a seasonal slump, a broker with Derek's apparent client list should possess enough liquid capital to cover standard overhead. The math did not align. A bridge loan of $45,000 plus the $75,000 drained from the custodial account equaled an immense deficit. Where was the money actually going? I picked up my cell phone again, preparing to send Victor a text message to ask that exact question. But before my fingers could tap the screen, the phone rang. It was Victor again. He had forgotten to mention one final detail from the forensic accountant's report. I answered, putting the device to my ear. Alicia, Victor said, his tone grim. My team dug deeper into the commercial operating account where your husband routed the stolen tuition funds. We tried to trace the outbound transfers to see which vendors he was paying to keep the brokerage afloat. I stood up, walking toward the window that overlooked the dark fog-covered lawn. I asked what they found. There are no vendors, Victor replied. The brokerage has not purchased inventory paid slip fees or compensated employees in over 6 months. The business license expired last spring. The Newport office space he claims to go to every day was leased to a different company back in February. The ground seemed to drop out from beneath my feet. I stared into the dark glass, seeing my own pale reflection. If the brokerage is closed, I asked, my voice barely a whisper, what is he doing with the money? Victor paused, the silence stretching over the cellular connection, heavy with impending ruin. He is paying off early investors, Victor said. The accountant believes your husband is not running a luxury boat business anymore. He is operating an elaborate, unauthorized investment pool among his country club peers. He is using fresh cash from his family to pay false dividends to his previous marks. The air vanished from my lungs. The forgery, the theft, the smear campaign, they were not just the actions of a greedy man. They were the frantic, desperate maneuvers of a criminal trying to keep a crumbling financial pyramid from collapsing directly onto his head. And he planned to use my pristine credit as his final shield. I ended the call with Victor Thorne, the silence of the dining room pressing against my eardrums. Kelsey sat perfectly still, staring at the empty trust fund statements, unaware that the floor beneath us had just vanished. The magnitude of Derek's deception expanded beyond a simple domestic betrayal. He was operating a shadow economy built on the stolen trust of his family and the gullibility of his wealthy peers. I looked at Kelsey. Her tears had dried, leaving pale streaks across her face. The anger that had fueled her arrival was gone, replaced by a hollow exhaustion. I could not tell her about the forgery. Not yet. I needed her to process the loss of her mother's legacy before I revealed the criminal depths her father had sunk to. "You should go home," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "You need rest. We have a long battle ahead of us, and I need you clear-headed." Kelsey nodded slowly. She gathered the bank statements, folding them with precise, almost robotic movements, and slid them into her coat pocket. She did not speak as she walked to the front door. She paused on the threshold, turning back to face me. "He is going to pay for this," she whispered, her voice devoid of emotion, a cold, hard vow. I watched her car headlights cut through the thick coastal fog, disappearing down the quiet Rhode Island street. I locked the deadbolt, sliding the brass chain into place. I needed to secure the house. I checked every window on the ground floor, drawing the heavy curtains tight, transforming my historic home into a fortress. I retreated to my home office, a small room tucked beneath the central staircase, previously used for sorting hospital logistics files. I powered on my desktop monitor, the screen illuminating the dark space. I needed to act. The forensic audit had exposed the rot, but I needed to build a firewall. I accessed my primary banking portal, initiating a complete lockdown. I froze all lines of credit, placing fraud alerts with the major credit bureaus. I transferred the remaining balances from our joint accounts into a newly established secure individual trust, leaving only enough funds to cover the automated utility drafts. I meticulously documented every transaction, taking digital screenshots and printing physical copies. I was building a paper trail, an impenetrable defense against any future claims of financial mismanagement. The process was exhausting, a tedious, methodical dismantling of a shared life. I operated with the cold efficiency of an executive liquidating a failed asset. But beneath the surface, a knot of terror tightened in my chest. Derek was not just a charming con man. He was a cornered predator. The Newport brokerage was a phantom, a shell company, hiding a micro-Ponzi scheme. He had burned through his country club contacts, extracting investments to cover previous debts, a frantic juggling act, destined for catastrophic failure. The stolen tuition funds and the forged loan application were the desperate gasps of a drowning man. He had nothing left to lose. A man with nothing to lose is a man capable of unimaginable violence, both financial and physical. He had already attempted to mortgage my home. He had already planted the seeds of my cognitive decline. He would stop at nothing to maintain his illusion, even if it meant destroying me completely. I needed to execute my exit strategy flawlessly. I could not afford a single misstep. I had to let him believe his bridge loan excuse had worked, buying me enough time to finalize the legal preparations and secure the criminal evidence. I had to play the role of the compliant, slightly confused wife, feeding his ego while quietly dismantling his empire. The next morning I woke before dawn, my mind sharp and focused. I dressed in a tailored Navy suit armor for the battle ahead. I arrived at the hospital early, bypassing my assistant and walking straight into the Human Resources Department. I scheduled a formal meeting with the director, presenting the digital screenshots of my secure banking portal and the physical printouts of the forged loan application. I did not offer tearful explanations. I presented the facts with the clinical precision of a surgeon. I explained that my husband was engaged in a complex financial fraud, and his phone call the previous day was a preemptive strike designed to undermine my credibility. I provided the contact information for my attorney, authorizing full cooperation with any internal investigations. The Human Resources Director sat in stunned silence, reviewing the documents. The pity that had clouded her eyes the day before vanished, replaced by a sharp, professional alarm. She assured me the hospital would support me entirely, recognizing the severity of the situation. I left the office, a wave of profound relief washing over me. I had secured my professional perimeter, The smear campaign had failed to take root in the sterile environment of the hospital network. But the battle lines were still drawn across the affluent social circles of Rhode Island. I drove back to South Kingstown, navigating the winding coastal roads. The fog had lifted, revealing a crisp, bright autumn afternoon. The ocean sparkled under the clear sky, a deceptive calm masking the turbulent currents below. I pulled into my driveway, bracing myself for the evening performance. Derek's silver sedan was parked in the garage. I walked through the front door, the heavy oak clicking shut behind me. The house smelled of expensive cologne and roasted garlic. Derek stood in the kitchen, humming a jazz tune, pouring a glass of amber scotch. He turned toward me, a bright, practiced smile spreading across his face. "How was your day at the hospital?" he asked, his tone smooth and unbothered, as if the world was exactly as he wanted it to be. I offered a tight, polite smile. "It was fine," I replied, my voice steady. "Just a little stressful." He nodded sympathetically, taking a sip of his drink. He did not know that the ground beneath his feet had already crumbled. He did not know that the trap was set, the evidence secured, and the final act was about to commence. He believed he was still the architect of the illusion, unaware that I had already rewritten the ending. A skilled predator possesses a distinct sixth sense. When intimidation fails to yield the desired result, they do not retreat. They simply change their camouflage. Derek had spent the last 48 hours trying to force me into a defensive posture by peddling the dementia narrative and questioning my sanity. But my sudden calm demeanor, the quiet way I moved through the house, unnerved him. Silence is a mirror, and a narcissist hates nothing more than staring into a void they cannot control. Sensing his grip slipping, my husband abandoned the psychological warfare and pivoted to his most effective historical weapon: romance. The performance began on a crisp Thursday evening. I was sitting in the formal living room, reading a procurement contract, when the front door swung open. Derek did not just walk into the foyer. He made an entrance. His arms were wrapped around a sprawling arrangement of rare white orchids, the delicate petals trembling with his exaggerated movements. Behind him, a delivery driver from a five-star seafood grill in Narragansett carried 3 large insulated catering bags. Derek directed the driver toward the dining room, handing him a folded, crisp $100 bill as a tip. He arranged the silver warming trays across the mahogany table. The rich aroma of butter-poached lobster, roasted asparagus, and seared scallops filled the air. He lit 2 tall taper candles, casting a warm, flickering glow across the room. He poured 2 glasses of an expensive vintage Cabernet, setting one carefully beside my usual chair. It was a flawless execution of domestic devotion. Any outsider peering through our original stained-glass windows would have seen a loving husband treating his hard-working wife to a spontaneous romantic evening. They would not have seen the small, flat plastic disc taped tightly against my ribcage. Before Derek arrived home, I had secured a digital audio recording device beneath my silk blouse. The wire traced the curve of my side, anchored by a strip of medical tape. The device was synced directly to a secure cloud server, monitored by my attorney, Victor Thorne. Rhode Island requires only one-party consent for recording conversations. Every breath, every lie, every calculated sigh Derek manufactured tonight was being digitally preserved as admissible evidence. I adjusted my posture, feeling the cold plastic press into my skin, and walked into the dining room. Derek pulled out my chair, offering a soft, contrite smile. I sat down, placing my linen napkin over my lap. He took his seat across from me, ignoring the extravagant food he had just purchased. Instead, he reached across the table, seeking my hand. I let him take it. His palms were warm, his thumb tracing the curve of my wedding band. Then, he began to cry. It was a masterful performance. His eyes welled with genuine tears tracking down his cheeks and catching the candlelight. His voice cracked with perfect vulnerability. He told me he was so sorry. He confessed to being overwhelmed, crushed under the immense weight of the struggling maritime economy. He blamed the shifting interest rates, the uncooperative banks, and the relentless pressure to maintain our standard of living. He painted himself as a desperate, drowning man who had made terrible, secretive choices only because he wanted to protect me from the harsh financial realities of his industry. "I want a fresh start, Alicia," he whispered, wiping a tear from his jaw. "I hate the distance between us. I hate the secrets. I want to lay everything out on the table and rebuild our life with total transparency. You are the only good thing I have left, and I cannot bear the thought of losing you over money." I listened to the symphony of his deceit, the digital recorder silently capturing every note. The dramatic irony was exquisite. He sat there deploying his ultimate emotional weapon, confident that his tears were melting my icy exterior. He thought he was playing the maestro conducting my forgiveness. He had no idea he was delivering a recorded confession directly to the fraud investigators. I squeezed his hand, offering a soft, reassuring nod. I told him I understood. I told him we could figure a way out of the dark together. I played the role of the devoted, forgiving spouse, mimicking the exact tone of a woman who just wanted her marriage to survive. The relief washing over his face was immediate. He exhaled a long, shaky breath, wiping his eyes with a crisp napkin. He served the lobster thermidor, the tension in his shoulders dissolving. We ate in relative peace for 20 minutes, the conversation shifting to mundane, pleasant topics. He waited until the plates were cleared and the second glass of Cabernet was poured before springing the actual trap. "To truly start over, we need to clean up the wreckage," he said gently, reaching down beside his chair. He lifted a thick, heavy manila envelope onto the mahogany table. He slid it toward my wine glass. "I met with a private lending specialist today. We can consolidate the lingering debts from the brokerage and combine them into a single, manageable portfolio. It will wipe the slate clean, Alicia. No more secrets. No more hidden stress." I looked down at the envelope. I did not need to open it to know what was inside. After the Warwick bank manager flagged his forged signature on the home equity line of credit, the original application stalled. Derek could not risk trying to forge my name a second time. He needed my actual, authenticated signature on a new set of refinancing papers to extract the equity from my historic South Kingstown home. He needed me to willingly sign away the sanctuary I had spent 30 years building. The sheer audacity of the maneuver was breathtaking. He disguised the ultimate betrayal as an act of romantic transparency. I rested my fingertips on the thick paper envelope. I offered him a calm, serene smile. I told him I was so relieved he was finally being honest with me. I promised to take the documents to my office the following morning, read them over with a fresh cup of coffee, and sign every single page. Derek beamed his charm, returning in full force. He raised his wine glass, proposing a toast to our new beginning. We clinked our glasses together. The sound mirrored the noise Kelsey had made at the restaurant 2 weeks prior. By the way, Derek added his tone casual and light. "The Newport Maritime Charity Gala is tomorrow evening. The investors will be there. It would mean the world to me if you wore that emerald silk dress and stood by my side. Showing them a united front will secure the final pieces of this transition." I picked up the manila envelope, feeling the heavy weight of the physical evidence in my hands. The audio recording of his coercion was secure. The fraudulent documents were now in my possession. The stage for his public execution was set. I looked into the eyes of the man who planned to render me homeless and smiled coldly. I told him I would not miss the gala for the world. The emerald silk dress flowed over my shoulders, heavy and cool against my skin. I stood before the full-length mirror in the master bedroom, fastening a string of pearls around my neck. The clasp clicked shut, a tiny metallic snap that felt like a lock turning on a vault. I studied my reflection in the glass. I did not look like a woman hovering on the brink of financial ruin. I looked exactly like the successful healthcare executive my husband needed me to be tonight. Derek waited at the bottom of the central staircase, wearing a bespoke tuxedo that fit him with tailored perfection. He smiled as I descended the steps, holding out his hand. He looked like the epitome of coastal success, the flawless yachtsman ready to conquer the annual Newport Maritime Charity Gala. He believed his tearful performance the previous evening had secured my unwavering compliance. He thought the fraudulent refinancing documents were resting safely in my leather briefcase, waiting for my signature on Monday morning. He had no idea those papers were already sitting in an evidence locker at my attorney's law firm, catalogued as Exhibit A. The drive to Newport took 40 minutes. The coastal highway wound past the dark, churning waters of Narragansett Bay. Derek talked the entire way, his voice vibrating with frantic, nervous energy. He rehearsed his networking pitch aloud, listing the names of the regional bankers, venture capitalists, and private equity partners attending the event. He needed a fresh injection of capital to feed his shadow economy, to pay off his previous marks before the entire pyramid collapsed. My pristine professional reputation was the premium bait he intended to cast into the water, and he assumed I was swimming right alongside him. We pulled up to the valet stand of a sprawling historic estate, a Gilded Age marvel perched on the edge of the ocean cliffs. The property featured towering limestone pillars, manicured terraced gardens, and windows blazing with golden light. It was the exact type of decaying grandeur Derek worshipped. We stepped out of the vehicle, the sharp Atlantic breeze cutting through the autumn night, carrying the scent of salt spray and crushed autumn leaves. The ballroom inside was a masterclass in orchestrated wealth. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the vaulted ceiling, casting a warm, shimmering glow over 200 guests. Waiters glided through the crowd, carrying silver trays lined with champagne flutes and caviar canapes. A string quartet played softly in the corner, providing a sophisticated soundtrack to the quiet hum of high-stakes networking. Derek thrived in this environment. He moved through the room with predatory grace, shaking hands, clapping shoulders, and leaning in to share private jokes with men wearing expensive watches. I walked beside him, a silent accessory, observing the intricate dance of social leverage. I recognized several faces in the crowd. The chief of surgery from my hospital was standing near a towering ice sculpture. The regional director of a major commercial lender was holding court near the terrace doors. These were people who trusted my judgment, individuals who relied on my operational competence to keep massive hospital budgets balanced. Derek intended to use their trust in me to legitimize his phantom investments. After an hour of casual mingling, the trap was finally set. Derek spotted his primary targets. A group of 3 affluent local investors stood near the grand marble fireplace discussing commercial zoning permits over glasses of aged scotch. Among them was a senior executive from the exact Warwick Bank where Derek had submitted the forged loan application weeks prior. My husband did not know the bank had flagged the signature. He only knew this executive possessed the authority to greenlight vast sums of unsecured capital, the exact lifeline he desperately needed. Derek placed his hand on the small of my back, guiding me toward the group. His touch was light, but the underlying pressure was a clear directive. He was steering me into position. We joined the circle, exchanging polite greetings. The men smiled, offering respectful nods in my direction. They knew my title. They knew my track record managing multi-million-dollar healthcare supply chains. Derek wasted no time. He launched into his rehearsed narrative, his voice dripping with smooth, practiced confidence. He spoke about a lucrative new joint venture, a coastal real estate development project he claimed we were launching together. He described luxury waterfront condominiums, exclusive marina access, and a guaranteed return on initial investment. He painted a vibrant picture of a dynamic power couple, combining his maritime sales expertise with my logistical brilliance to create an unstoppable enterprise. He moved his hand from my back to my waist, tightening his grip, pulling me a fraction closer to his side. It was a physical manifestation of his supposed control over my assets, a silent signal to the men in the circle that we were an unbreakable unit. He looked at the Warwick Bank executive, his smile dazzling and bright. Alicia and I are incredibly excited about this transition, Derek said, projecting his voice just loud enough so the surrounding guests could hear the success in his tone. We are consolidating our portfolios to focus entirely on this development. It is the perfect synergy. The bank executive nodded, taking a thoughtful sip of his bourbon. He looked directly at me, his expression reflecting genuine professional curiosity. "I have to ask Alicia," the executive said, his tone polite and conversational. "Managing the operations for an entire regional healthcare network is a monumental task. How do you find the time to oversee a commercial real estate venture on top of your hospital duties?" The string quartet finished a movement at that exact moment, allowing a brief lull to settle over the ballroom. Conversations at the adjacent tables naturally paused as people took sips of their drinks. The ambient noise of the gala dipped, creating a pocket of unexpected silence around our circle near the fireplace. Derek looked down at me, his eyes shining with heavy expectation. He squeezed my waist, prompting me to deliver the lie we had implicitly agreed upon over our catered dinner. He expected me to offer a graceful brag about time management to validate the Phantom project and to secure his financial survival. I looked at the bank executive. Then I looked down at the hand resting on my waist. The same hand that had pinned my wrist to the table at Coastline Prime. The same hand that had typed the digital wire transfer draining a college fund while I cried in a hospital waiting room. The same hand that had forged my signature to steal the equity from my home. I did not smile. I took a deliberate step backward, slipping entirely out of Derek's physical grasp. The sudden movement severed the illusion of unity, leaving his hand hovering awkwardly in the empty space between us. I squared my shoulders, adopting the exact rigid posture I used when terminating fraudulent vendors at the hospital. I kept my voice clear, level, and projected it outward, ensuring the acoustics of the vaulted ballroom carried my words far beyond our immediate circle. "I am not involved in Derek's businesses," I stated. The bank executive blinked his polite smile, faltering. Derek lowered his hand, a flash of genuine confusion crossing his features. He let out a nervous, breathless chuckle, attempting to salvage the moment before the damage became permanent. "Alicia is just being modest," Derek interrupted, taking a quick step toward me. "She prefers to stay behind the scenes and let me handle the public-facing details." I held up my hand, a sharp gesture that stopped his advance instantly. I did not break eye contact with the banking executive. "I am not being modest," I continued, my diction sharp and precise. "I have zero involvement in any real estate development, nor do I endorse any investment portfolios managed by my husband. In fact, our forensic accountant is currently investigating why Derek forged my signature on a loan application to cover his bankrupt brokerage." The silence that followed was total. It was not the polite lull of a passing conversation. It was the sudden, breathless vacuum of oxygen leaving a room. The clinking of crystal flutes ceased entirely. The string quartet, sensing the severe shift in the atmosphere, trailed off into a discordant squeak of violin bows. The bank executive stared at me, his eyes widening as the severe implication of my words registered. He looked at Derek, the professional respect dissolving into sharp, clinical suspicion. The other investors in the circle physically recoiled, taking actual steps backward, creating a wide berth around my husband, as if he were suddenly highly contagious. Derek stood frozen in his bespoke tuxedo. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. The charming yachtsman facade shattered into 1,000 pieces, revealing the desperate, cornered predator underneath. He opened his mouth to speak, to deploy his charm to spin a new lie, but no sound emerged. The magnitude of the public exposure paralyzed his vocal cords. The guests standing at the neighboring tables had heard every single syllable. The whispers began to ripple through the ballroom, a rising tide of shock and harsh judgment. The social elite of Rhode Island, the very people Derek relied upon to fund his shadow economy, were now witnesses to his execution. I did not wait for him to recover his voice. I did not offer a tearful explanation to the stunned crowd. I had delivered the absolute truth, and the truth required no further decoration. I turned my back on the man who thought he could use my life as collateral. I began walking toward the grand exit of the ballroom, my emerald silk dress sweeping across the marble floor, leaving the architect of the illusion standing alone in the center of the wreckage. But as I reached the heavy brass doors of the exit, a new voice cut through the stunned murmurs of the crowd, introducing a final reckoning Derek never saw coming. The heavy silence hung over the Newport ballroom. It was not a peaceful quiet, but a suffocating vacuum, the kind of stillness that precedes a sudden structural collapse. The string quartet had ceased playing their bows, hovering awkwardly over their instruments. The affluent guests surrounding us stood frozen, their champagne flutes suspended in midair. I watched my husband process the catastrophic failure of his social trap. The color leached from his cheeks, leaving a stark, pale mask. For a fleeting second, the polished yachtsman disappeared, replaced by a cornered predator calculating its survival route. His eyes darted toward the Warwick Bank executive, then back to me, assessing the blast radius of my statement. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing above his crisp silk bow tie. Then the survival instinct engaged. He forced a dry, hollow laugh. The sound echoed awkwardly across the expansive marble floor, sharp and unconvincing. He turned toward the circle of investors, raising his hands in a gesture of profound, tragic surrender. He was deploying his final, most insidious weapon. "I must apologize," Derek murmured, his voice adopting a sickeningly gentle cadence, the specific tone reserved for mourning deep tragedies. "My wife has been under terrible mental stress. I have tried my best to keep her condition private, but her memory is failing. She is suffering from severe paranoia, mixing up financial documents from my commercial operations with her own personal accounts." He looked around the circle of esteemed guests, his eyes pleading for their sympathy, playing the role of the devoted caretaker to perfection. "We are seeking neurological help," he continued, his tone thick with manufactured grief. "Please excuse her outburst. It is the illness speaking today, not the brilliant woman I love." He reached out, attempting to place a comforting hand on my shoulder, trying to physically guide me away from the audience. The narrative he had carefully planted throughout the Rhode Island country clubs was now serving as his ultimate shield. I saw the hesitation flicker in the eyes of the guests. The bank executive shifted his weight, exchanging a brief, uncertain glance with his colleagues. The danger of Derek's gaslighting was its undeniable plausibility. A prominent healthcare director, cracking under relentless corporate pressure, was a narrative they could easily digest. He was offering them a polite, socially acceptable excuse to ignore my allegations and continue their lucrative networking. I stepped out of his reach, my posture rigid. I did not need to raise my voice to defend my sanity. I did not need to scream or plead for them to believe me. The universe possesses a remarkable way of delivering justice when you simply stand your ground and let the truth run its course. From the periphery of the gathering, a new figure pushed through the throng of tailored suits and sequined evening gowns. The crowd parted, low murmurs rippling outward as the guests recognized the intruder. It was Kelsey. She did not belong in this scene of curated opulence. She wore a simple wool trench coat over dark denim, her hair pulled back into a messy knot. her face devoid of the heavy cosmetics she usually favored. The contrast between her stark, grounded appearance and the glittering ballroom was jarring. She walked straight into the center of the circle, bypassing the wealthy financiers, and stopped directly in front of her father. Derek blinked, his jaw slacking. The sympathetic husband routine evaporated in an instant. Kelsey hissed, his tone sharp and commanding, dropping the gentle facade. "What are you doing here? Go wait in the car. This is a professional event." She did not flinch. The young woman who had crumpled onto my dining room floor mere hours earlier had forged her grief into a sharp, unyielding weapon. She looked at the man who had raised her, the man who had taught her to view kindness as an endless resource to be exploited, and she squared her shoulders. "She is telling the truth, Dad," Kelsey said. Her voice was not loud, but it possessed a raw, piercing clarity that cut through the lingering murmurs of the ballroom. Derek stiffened, his eyes widening in pure panic. "Stop talking," he commanded, stepping toward her. "You do not understand what is happening here." "I understand everything," Kelsey replied, holding her ground, refusing to shrink away. She turned her head slightly, sweeping her gaze over the circle of investors, ensuring they heard every single syllable. "You stole my trust fund, too. The money my mother left for me. You drained every last cent to pay for this fake life." The poetic justice of the moment was breathtaking. 2 weeks ago, sitting at the pristine table at Coastline Prime, Derek had gripped my wrist and publicly demanded I remain silent. He had declared that she was not my daughter, instructing me never to correct her behavior. He had used her as a shield to protect his fragile ego, reinforcing a dynamic where he held all the authority. Now standing in the center of the high society he worshipped, he was being corrected by the very offspring he had weaponized against me. The daughter he groomed to be an entitled accessory had become the primary architect of his public destruction. Derek opened his mouth, grasping for a lifeline, searching for another lie to explain away his own child's devastating accusation. But his audience was gone. The Warwick Bank executive lowered his glass of bourbon, his expression hardening into cold, professional disgust. The whispers surrounding us morphed into outright condemnations. The Gilded Age illusion was in ruins. The foundation had rotted through, and the entire structure was collapsing onto the marble floor. I opened the brass clasp of my evening clutch. Reaching inside, my fingers brushed against a stack of thick, heavy paper stock. I pulled out the glossy gold-embossed business cards. They were the exact cards Derek had handed to the waiter at the restaurant, the tokens of his fabricated success. I had retrieved them from his home office desk earlier that afternoon, anticipating this exact confrontation. I stepped forward, holding the stack out to the Warwick Bank executive. He took them hesitantly, his eyes darting from the gold lettering to my face. I handed another card to the chief of surgery, and a third to the regional commercial lender. They turned the pristine cards over in their hands, discovering the modification I had made. On the back of each white rectangle, I had written a specific 10-digit phone number using a dark ink pen. "You can reach the financial fraud detectives at the number I wrote on the back." I stated, my voice echoing in the quiet space, carrying the weight of unassailable truth. "They are highly anticipating your calls regarding any pending capital investments, unsecured loan applications, or forged signatures involving Newport Brokerage." I closed my clutch. The sharp snap of the brass clasp served as the final punctuation mark on our marriage. I did not look at Derek again. I did not need to see the devastation on his face, nor did I care to witness the inevitable scramble as the local authorities descended upon his shattered empire. I turned my back on the marble fireplace, the stunned bankers, and the wreckage of his life. I began walking toward the grand exit of the ballroom. The crowd of Rhode Island elite parted for me, creating a wide, silent corridor. My emerald silk dress rustled against the floor tiles, the only sound accompanying my departure. The crisp coastal breeze greeted me as the valet opened the heavy wooden doors. I stepped out into the dark autumn night, leaving the chaos behind, breathing in the cold, clean air of my reclaimed independence. The air in Rhode Island possesses a distinct, restorative crispness in late October. It is the kind of cold that clears the lungs and sharpens the mind, carrying the faint, briny scent of Narragansett Bay through the turning autumn foliage. 1 year after I walked out of that Newport ballroom, I sat on the wraparound porch of my historic South Kingstown home. The morning sun cast long, golden shadows across the frost-covered lawn. I held a ceramic mug of dark roast coffee, letting the heat seep into my palms. The silence surrounding my property was profound, but it no longer felt like the heavy, suffocating quiet of a hostage situation. It felt like breathing. My son Connor sat in the wicker chair opposite mine, wearing a thick wool sweater and reviewing a set of civil engineering blueprints on his tablet. He reached over, grabbing a warm blueberry muffin from the basket resting on the small wicker table between us. We did not need to fill the space with constant chatter. The comfortable, easy stillness was a luxury I had fought bitterly to reclaim. We spent the morning discussing his latest bridge project over the Providence River and debating whether to repaint the wooden shutters on my Victorian exterior before the winter snow arrived. It was a remarkably ordinary Sunday, and after the hurricane I had survived 12 months prior, ordinary felt like a miracle. The dismantling of Derrick Lane had been a swift, clinical process. Real-life justice rarely involves dramatic courtroom shouting matches or sudden cinematic confessions. It usually takes the form of relentless, unyielding paperwork. The morning following the charity gala, the Warwick Bank executive made a phone call. The financial fraud detectives obtained warrants, and by Tuesday afternoon, investigators were hauling cardboard boxes out of the Phantom Newport brokerage office. The micro-Ponzi scheme unraveled with terrifying speed once the initial thread was pulled. The wealthy investors Derrick relied upon to fund his extravagant lifestyle turned against him, instantly transforming from his closest country club allies into federal witnesses. My attorney, Victor Thorne, utilized the audio recording of the catered dinner and the forged refinancing application to secure a watertight legal separation. I shielded my individual assets, entirely severing the marital estate before the federal government could seize our joint accounts to pay back the defrauded investors. Derrick lost everything. He surrendered his luxury silver sedan, his tailored suits, and his pristine credit rating. Today, he resides in a modest weekly rate motel near the state border, awaiting trial on multiple counts of wire fraud and identity theft. The Gilded Age facade he worshipped had rotted away entirely, leaving him trapped in the bleak, inescapable reality of his own actions. The crunch of tires on gravel interrupted my reflections. A practical, older model sedan pulled into my driveway, stopping near the edge of the manicured lawn. The engine clicked off and the driver door opened. Kelsey stepped out into the crisp autumn air. The transformation in her appearance was striking. The designer coastal apparel and pristine eyelash extensions were gone. She wore faded denim jeans, a simple canvas jacket, and practical leather boots, showing signs of real wear. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a functional braid, and she carried a canvas tote bag instead of a luxury leather purse. She did not strut toward the porch with the breezy, unearned confidence of the girl who had mocked me over a glass of Pinot Grigio. She walked with the grounded, measured steps of a young woman who had spent the last year carrying the weight of her own survival. Connor stood up, offering her a polite, cautious nod. Kelsey returned the greeting, her smile genuine, though slightly hesitant. She climbed the wooden steps, the floorboards groaning under her boots. I did not stand, but I gestured toward the empty rocking chair beside me. "I brought pastry," she said, lifting a white cardboard box from a local bakery in Kingston. "I know Connor likes the apple turnovers." "Thank you," I replied, keeping my tone warm and even. "Have a seat. I can pour you a cup of coffee. She accepted the mug, wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic, settling into the rocking chair. We sat together, the three of us, watching the morning light filter through the bare branches of the oak trees. Kelsey had not come to ask for money. She had stopped asking for handouts the day she stared at the empty ledger of her mother's stolen trust fund. Over the past year, we had slowly forged a tentative, respectful truce. It was not a mother and daughter relationship, and it never would be. But it was a connection built on a shared, harsh reality. Kelsey was finishing her final semester at the university. Without the endless fountain of stolen wealth to float her lifestyle, she had been forced to visit the financial aid office. She secured student loans, carrying the heavy burden of debt, like thousands of her peers. She took a part-time job waiting tables at a busy seafood diner near the campus, learning the true value of a $20 bill by spending hours on her feet carrying heavy trays of fried clams and clam chowder. "Work is exhausting," Kelsey admitted, taking a careful sip of her coffee. "We had a rush last night after the hockey game. I did not get out of the kitchen until past midnight. My feet are still throbbing." "It builds character," Connor teased gently, taking a bite of his turnover. "It builds calluses," Kelsey corrected, a dry, self-deprecating humor coloring her voice. "But I paid my own rent on Friday. The landlord handed me the receipt, and I realized it was the first time in my entire life I had truly earned the roof over my head. It felt good. Tiring, but good." I looked at her, recognizing the hard-won pride shining in her eyes. She had lost her trust fund, her luxury vehicle, and the illusion of a perfect father, but she had gained something far more valuable. She had gained her independence. The crucible of her father's betrayal had burned away the toxic entitlement, leaving behind a resilient, capable adult. "I am proud of you," I said. She met my gaze, the vulnerability shining clear and bright. "Thank you," she whispered. "And thank you for not letting him pull you down with him. If you had kept paying, if you had just stayed quiet, I think I would still be asleep. I would still be that spoiled kid." "You woke up," I replied softly. "That is all that matters now." We spent another hour on the porch sharing the bakery items and discussing her upcoming graduation plans. When she finally stood to leave, offering a wave before driving her older sedan down the coastal road, I felt a profound sense of closure settle over the property. Looking back on the wreckage of my marriage, I realized the most dangerous trap a capable woman can fall into is the belief that her endurance is a form of love. We are taught to absorb the hits to manage the stress and to keep the peace at all costs. We mistakenly equate giving endlessly with being valued. But true grace does not mean serving as a financial sponge for people who refuse to respect your humanity. You can pay for every luxury, solve every crisis, and fund every dream, and still be treated like a disposable guest in your own life. If any part of this story felt familiar to you, if you are currently sitting at a table biting your tongue while your resources are drained by someone who diminishes your worth, I need you to hear this truth. The moment you stop begging for basic respect and start enforcing your own boundaries, the entire dynamic shifts. You do not need to throw a tantrum. You do not need to argue with someone committed to misunderstanding you. You simply need to look clearly at the exploitation, accept the reality of the situation, and remove your structural support. Sometimes the most powerful, devastating action a woman can take is to fold her napkin, smile politely, and simply stop paying for the privilege of being used. The quiet that settles into a house after a Category 5 emotional hurricane is a peculiar thing. It is not the empty, ringing silence of loneliness, but rather the deep, settling stillness of a foundation that has finally stopped shaking. Looking out over the frost-covered lawns of South Kingstown, watching the morning mist roll off Narragansett Bay, I have spent the last year reflecting not just on the anatomy of a financial fraud, but on the deeper, more insidious illusions we harbor about family responsibility and what it actually means to raise a child in modern America. In our culture, we are sold a very specific, highly curated vision of what it means to be a good parent. We are bombarded with the idea that success is measured by the sheer volume of resources we can pour into our children. We equate love with a leased luxury SUV, a premium cell phone plan, and fully funded out-of-state tuition. We are told that a thriving traditional family is one where the children never have to struggle, where their paths are swept entirely clear of debris. We mistake the accumulation of comfort for the building of character. For 2 years, I was complicit in this uniquely American delusion. I thought that by acting as an endless financial shock absorber for my stepdaughter Kelsey, I was demonstrating maternal grace. I believed that quietly paying the bills and smoothing over her father's erratic behavior was the ultimate expression of family loyalty. I assumed that if I just provided enough stability, she would eventually grow into a mature, emotionally aware adult. I was entirely wrong. Derek, my ex-husband, represented the dark underbelly of this cultural expectation. He was a man obsessed with the Gilded Age facade, the sprawling Newport mansions that look magnificent from the ocean but are rotting from the salt spray within. He raised his daughter using the exact same architectural blueprint. He taught her that appearances mattered more than integrity, that charm was a valid substitute for hard work, and that accountability was something only other people had to face. By shielding her from the financial realities of the world, by constantly rewriting the rules to ensure she never felt the sting of a declined credit card or a missed deadline, he was not protecting her. He was actively sabotaging her. He was raising an emotional infant in the body of a 21-year-old woman, someone entirely unequipped to navigate a world that would not always bend to her tantrums. The turning point of our entire family tragedy did not occur in the sterile boardroom of my hospital, nor did it happen in the glittering ballroom of the Newport Maritime Charity Gala. The true reckoning happened in the quiet shadows of my dining room, when I slid the empty statements of Kelsey's stolen trust fund across the mahogany table. That was the moment the illusion fractured. Watching a young woman realize that the man who had given her everything had actually stolen her future was a profound lesson in emotional awareness. It is a terrifying thing to watch a child's foundational understanding of the world shatter. The instinct, the desperate maternal urge, is to rush in, gather the pieces, and try to glue the illusion back together. You want to offer a loan, a bridge, a soft place to land, but true family responsibility requires a much harder discipline. It requires the discipline of standing back and allowing the shatter to happen. We talk often about traditional family structures, as if the mere shape of the family, a mother, a father, a shared roof, is what gives it strength. But a structure is only as strong as the honesty of the materials used to build it. A family built on gaslighting, financial manipulation, and the avoidance of hard truths is just a beautifully decorated house of cards. Honesty and fairness are not just moral concepts to be cross-stitched onto living room pillows. They are the necessary, sometimes painful friction required to forge a functional adult. When Kelsey's safety net was abruptly removed, she did not disintegrate. Stripped of her father's toxic financial supply, forced to take out student loans, and made to work late shifts carrying heavy trays at a seafood diner, she finally began to grow. She learned the actual weight of a $20 bill. She learned the quiet dignity of paying her own rent. She developed a profound emotional awareness that no amount of sorority dues or designer coastal apparel could ever have purchased. The friction of reality, the very thing her father tried to spare her from, was the only thing that could save her. If you have ever found yourself standing in the wreckage of a one-sided relationship, if you have ever felt the sharp, unappreciated sting of sacrificing your own peace to maintain someone else's comfortable illusion, you are not alone. These quiet, hidden battles happen behind the pristine front doors of countless homes. I invite you to like, subscribe, and follow Emily Told Stories to explore more narratives that dive beneath the surface of the American dream, unraveling the complex, sometimes painful truths about love, boundaries, and survival. The greatest lesson I extracted from the ruins of my marriage goes against everything we are traditionally taught about parental love and family duty. We are conditioned to believe that the ultimate act of devotion is to lay ourselves down as a foundation to let our families build their lives upon our endless sacrifices. We are told that a good parent is a shield, absorbing every blow so the child never feels the impact. But I have come to believe the exact opposite. Endless sacrifice is not love, it is enabling. When you refuse to let a child feel the consequences of their actions, when you constantly pay the ransom for their poor behavior, you are not teaching them how to live. You are simply teaching them how to use you. The most profound, defining act of love you can offer a child or any person you hold dear is not to carry their weight forever. The truest form of love is having the courage to step completely out of the way, allowing them to fall hard against the cold, unforgiving ground of reality. Because it is only there, bruised and entirely unsupported by your wallet or your excuses, that they will finally discover whether they have the strength to stand up on their own. Look closely at the people in your life who demand your constant, silent support. Are you helping them build a life, or are you just funding the illusion of one? And more importantly, when the fog finally rolls in and the facades begin to rot, who will be left paying the price for the truth you refuse to tell?